Welcome to another edition of GrokTALK. This week, my guest is Jim Simpson, and it's over to the big board. Jim is an investigative journalist, businessman, and former economist and budget examiner for the White House Office of Management and Budget. Since 1995, he has written nonfiction articles for various periodicals based both on his experience in government and business and a long-standing interest in public policy. Jim is best known for his expose on the Cloward-Piven strategy of manufactured crisis. His work provided the background for Glenn Beck's TV series on the subject. He is featured in Curtis Bauer's award-winning documentary Agenda: Grinding Down America, Trevor Loudon's The Enemies Within, and Enemies Within the Church, and is a frequent guest on radio and TV talk shows. Jim's work has been published in the Washington Times, WorldNet Daily, The Federalist, American Thinker, Accuracy in Media, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Center for Security Policy, and many others, including GrokTALK.com. Jim joins us today to talk about his latest book, Manufactured Crisis, and you're going to want to see this. Stay tuned. Welcome back to another edition of GrokTALK. Today, my guest is Jim Simpson. Jim and I have known each other for 10 years, pardon me, and this started way back in 2015 when we did a video of his presentation on the red-green axis, which was about refugee resettlement, and you blew my mind then. I was just like, wow, I could not believe how much money was involved, who the players were, and interestingly enough, when we get to the point where we talk about your latest book, Manufactured Crisis, it's a lot of the same people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's an agenda.
Right, and that's the whole point. And of course, I was going through our interviews, and we talked about that. You did Red Green Axis 2. We did Who is Karl Marx in 2021, and now we're up to 2024, 2025, and your latest book is Manufactured Crisis: The War to End America. And I think everybody who's listening should go back and look for these books, because you'll follow the trail and the connections. And while you do a great job in your latest book of just going over all the craziness that has been going on, let's start with the seeds of crisis. I mean, this really literally goes back to how we started.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And, really, you can trace all this stuff, frankly, to the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx, and even some of the things that Marx said and did before he wrote the Communist Manifesto with his partner, Friedrich Engels. But the one person I talk about in Seeds of Crisis, also I devote an entire chapter to him in Who Was Karl Marx, is a guy named Sergei Nechayev, who nobody's ever heard of. Most historians couldn't tell you who he was, but he was famous in his day. He was a head of the Russian Nihilist Society, which was an anarchist group which was responsible for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And he headed this thing. And he wrote something called the Revolutionary Catechism, which became the blueprint for communist revolution everywhere. And he said, all we care about is the happiness of the masses. And so, however, in order to give them that happiness, we first have to destroy everything. We have to destroy the world as it is so we can rebuild it implicitly on our socialist model. And he said, so in that regard, we are going to seek to increase the evils and miseries of the people until at last their patience is exhausted and they're driven to a general uprising. So that's really where we are today. It was definitely where we were in 2020, when everybody was at everybody's throats, and it really did look like we were facing a civil war. That's been the communist playbook since the beginning. They want other people to fight for them so that they can just sit back and enjoy the show. And frankly, that's what they've been trying to do in the United States for 100 years. And they have attacked us asymmetrically, not through, well, in a sense, through our military, by degrading it with things like transgender celebration month and all kinds of other DEI stuff that they claim is so important, when in fact all it's doing is undermining uh, good morale and discipline in the military, uh, and so they're really undermining that. But more directly, they're attacking our culture, every aspect of our culture, and creating crises that they can use over and over again. And I quote in the book, and if you don't mind, I will actually read what I wrote because I can't say it. Let's see. Hold on. Seeds of Crisis. Let's get there. So, okay. So, a friend of mine who used to be a radical leftist and had an epiphany when he realized just how bad these people were, and he became the most outspoken anti-communist you've ever met. We're still friends. He's old and he's had a lot of physical problems, but I talked with him just last week. But anyway, he paraphrased what Lenin thought about crisis, and he said, deepen the contradictions, that is, exaggerate, exacerbate existing crises, problems, and social and ethnic differences and disparities, opinion discrepancies, rifts, etc. And if they don't exist, create them. Or if you can't create them, convincingly claim that they exist and then deepen them. And in the process, profit the most in any way you can, politically, ideologically, and financially. And in the resulting chaos, blame our enemies for the whole mayhem, and then finally come up with solutions that will be the new fruit of new future crises to be exploited in the future, and so on until the targeted capitalist society is destroyed. And that was what the only thing that Marx really made explicit in the Communist Manifesto was that the goal was destruction, and it was destruction of the West as we know it. He called it destruction of society, but he was referring explicitly to destruction of the West and monarchies, and last but not least, the United States of America, which, as the first Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin realized, was the most important enemy they had because it was the only one that could really credibly challenge their power. And so, whether we were peaceful or wanted to be friendly or not, it didn't matter. Our very existence threatened theirs, so we had to be exterminated.
So Sergei Nechayev, who I hadn't heard of until I read your book about Marx,
Yeah,
comes up quite a bit
yeah,
when I do my blogging, and every now and then it
yeah,
comes
yeah.
in, and
No,
so and it just people go, why are they doing this? And I quote him. I go, look, this is the goal: destroy everything,
yeah,
burn it all down, and then
yeah,
somehow something magically will emerge from the ashes.
yeah,
And everybody's like, oh, well, I don't know, because it seems so hard to grasp until you go, well, look at history. Look what they've done.
right.
This is exactly who they
Yeah,
are. And in
yeah,
America, and of course in manufactured crisis, you really literally itemize a lot of the things that have been going on that we've been seeing that prior to the election of Donald Trump were a lot more terrifying than they are today. And we'll talk about that a little bit, about what you think. I know, because in your solutions, and he Jim always includes a what we can do chapter near the end of the book after showing you all this evidence and all this data and all this crisis and all these horrible things and these horrible people. And he says, this is what we need to do. And one of those things was elect Donald Trump. Don't let Kamala Harris become
yeah.
the next president, because that would be the end of America. We'll get into that in a second. But let's talk about you got a lot of good things in here. If you even just go through I'm going to read the chapter list real quickly, and you can jump on anything you want. But for people who are
Okay,
watching, so it was the
sure.
seeds of crisis, crisis strategy, that all cheaters might vote, strategic corruption, weaponizing the poor, the war on Black America, surge the border, making taxpayers a minority. Why do they do it? Political, is it ponerology? Is that how you pronounce that?
Honorology. Yep, yep.
The fountain of
Political
evil.
honorology, the
Yeah.
fountain of evil.
DEI,
Yeah,
the weaponization of culture, Agenda 2030, ESG, social credit, and the war on capitalism. I know a lot of you were like, I got to read this book now. Save the planet, kill everything. January 6th was not an insurrection, an international conspiracy, and what is to be done. So it's just under 400 pages. There's a lot of detail in here. This
Yeah.
is great stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I really, it represents really a summary of my research and writing on the left, which I've been doing for almost 40 years at this point. So it really represents a summary of my life's work, although my life's work is not over. I
I
mean,
hope
I'm
not.
not retiring, even if I could afford to retire, because despite what people may think, even though Karl Marx's book was an Amazon bestseller, you'd be surprised how little that turns out to be in terms of real income, especially once taxes are taken out and everything. So basically, I wouldn't exactly say I'm a starving artist. If I said that, I'd be lying because I got about 20 pounds to get off my gut. But, 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 uh, but it's a constant effort to, on our side, make money if we're going to be doing this. And I didn't do it to make money. I did it to inform people because when I realized what was going on, and that was in 1987, I didn't sleep for 3 days. And I knew that we had to do something because if we lost our country to the communists, and that's what we're really talking about here, uh, we would be um, in line for a horror that most people can't even imagine in their worst nightmares. And
Now,
so,
I have for a long time argued that a lot of what they're doing, and obviously it's the cloud pivoting of America. I mean, all of this can be linked to that.
uh, yep.
Is that they have been
Mhm.
trying very, very hard, and they showed their cards during COVID to push the middle
Yeah.
class far enough that they would demand the kind of security and censorship that communism requires. And
Yeah.
so, interestingly enough, as ugly as those few years were, would you agree that it seems like we had the opposite response?
Well, in a certain sense, and I mean, I hate to say it because honestly, thousands of people died as a result, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people. We don't really know, right?
Hmm.
Um, but just uh, forget about COVID, just the border.
Hmm.
Biden administration murdered thousands of people just because of the open border and the migration itself, which was responsible for mass rapes and mass murder. Uh, they are responsible for that stuff, and I think they should be held as accessories to the crime because they were violating both their oath to the U.S. Constitution and the laws that existed, which required they enforce a border. And so, um, yeah, you can talk about this directly in those terms. Um, yeah, it's just it's quite amazing. But here's what I was going to say. Despite all that, in a there is a silver lining in every cloud. Those were some pretty big black clouds that we experienced for the last 4 years. But the silver lining was it finally burned through to enough people that they saw what was going on and said, okay, no more. We've had enough. And a lot of that was because the people woke up. I also credit the Trump administration for being very activist in getting out there and explaining things. You have guys like Charlie Kirk going to all the various
Hmm.
college campuses and challenging people. Those things had an impact. And then there was the other guy, I forget his name, long haired guy, who went to Pennsylvania and basically registered enough Republicans in Pennsylvania that Pennsylvania won. I mean, we had a few people out there that single handedly helped win this election. And we had the Trump administration sending attorneys to election offices to make sure that the Democrats were unable to terrorize election officials like they have been for decades uh, just by showing up and challenging everything that didn't line up with the Democrat agenda. So a lot of things that people did, I credit the Trump campaign, the GOP for once in its life got up its rear end and actually did something, and but people woke up. People realized, no, we can't have this anymore, and so we got this uh, really big um, victory that if there was ever a mandate, we now have a mandate. And I still think that there was a lot of vote fraud committed. And if it had been totally free and fair elections, the House and the Senate would be supermajority Republican on both houses. There would be massive majorities in Republican state legislatures all over the country, and Trump's victory would have been even larger than it was.
I don't disagree, and this really, I think, in some respects, goes back to refugee resettlement and the conveyor that the UN and the
Immigration.
Biden administration put up. One of my most popular posts on my Substack is, "If it's not displacement, what is it?" So basically, the premise is, well, we have the crime you just discussed, we have the child rapes, we have the rapes of women, we have, the gangs, we have Venezuelan gangs taking over property in the U.S., all of it, the robbery, everything, And then, so I'm like, well, if that's not what you're after, what is it you're trying to do? So my theory was, well, this kind of proves displacement, which of course is correct because they've been doing this since way back when. And we talked about it back in 2015. We talked about it in 2022, and we're talking about it again. And so the conveyor comes up, it brings all these people in. And one of the things that struck me over the last year as the election was brewing along was how citizens in Chicago and New York and Boston were coming out, minorities, people who live in the city, and saying, "What are you doing to us? You're bringing all these people in, and you can't even take care of us." Do you think
Right.
that helped Trump?
Oh, yes. Oh, no, absolutely. The immigration issue was one of the biggest uh, benefits to the Trump campaign of anything because everybody saw firsthand and experienced firsthand this replacement migration. And, they all called us conspiracy theorists for bringing up the idea of replacement migration. And I was just looking on one of my PowerPoints. It's the wrong one, but I wanted to bring up the slide. I couldn't find it of the page in the United Nations where they describe their program of replacement migration, which I first identified back in 2015 in my first refugee resettlement book. They had said at the time, for decades, they've been saying, "Oh, you people have to. The world's being overpopulated, so you have to reduce your reproduction rates to replacement or less." And we, like foolish people, went, "Oh, okay," and we reduced our population to basically zero population growth. In Europe, it's negative population growth, but then in the 80s, UN came out and said, "Oh, you stupid people. Why would you do such a thing? You will need replacement migration in order to shore up your populations so you'll have enough youths to cover to do the jobs that you now no longer have youths for because you have foolishly reduced your populations." And it's the funniest thing in the world. And what's even funnier is it was a program they they absolutely advocated in the early days of place replacement migration, and I have pictures of that from earlier PowerPoints I did way back when. Today, they call replacement migration. They use it as a question: is replacement migration a good idea? And of course, the summary of the of the page is, yes, of course it's a good idea, but the fact that they raised this as a question, I believe, is because they changed it from a statement to a question following the fact that I uncovered it in that book. They adjust their rhetoric when some of their agendas gets exposed. They adjust their rhetoric so that they can basically say the same thing but claim that they're not.
Let's jump on that and talk about DEI, which was enjoying a golden age for a little bit, and then in the last 6 to 8 months, it sort of started to become this thing that companies and organizations are trying to step away from.
Yeah. Gee, I wonder why that is. I don't think it could have anything to do with the LA fires. No, you know, the LA fires weren't created by DEI. They were just wildfires. Sure they were. It's just that there wasn't any water in any of the fire hydrants. They needed to put out these fires. There wasn't any preparation for the fires as there usually was because the fire department had been defunded. Uh, and the governor and the mayor both had focused on how important it was to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of their various public services. So they had, you know, overweight female firefighters put up as, fire chiefs, police chiefs. People couldn't, you know, uh, uh, do anything required physically for the job, but were put there because they clicked all the right boxes. They were the right color, they were the right sex, they were the right sexual preference, they were the right age, and and that's the result. The same thing with Boeing. Boeing's starting to have aircraft fall out of the sky. Why is that? Well, they used to have very good engineers. Now they have DEI engineers, people who they've replaced so that they can check all those DEI boxes and ignore totally competence in the job. And, as people start dying as a result of these insane, disgusting policies, racist, bigoted, uh, unfair policies, uh, people are starting to open their eyes and say, you know what, this might not be such a good idea.
And you focused an entire chapter in your book on this in Manufactured Crisis,
Sure did.
DEI, the weaponization of the culture. It's a
Yep,
good deep dive into it. And it's just the Marxists being Marxists, more or less.
the same thing. It's just, like I say, you have to look at the entire left wing agenda from 30,000 feet. You don't look at it from the standpoint of each individual issue. The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution, as a former radical once said. They don't care about DEI. They don't care about transgender rights. They don't care about immigrant rights. They don't care about Indian rights. They don't care about anything except in the way that they can use it to insinuate themselves into positions of power. And it's always the idea of compassion for this group or that group, which is for some reason helpless and can't do anything itself, which of course requires a federal government response. And the answer is always to centralize power in the federal government. And as Lenin said, to create crises. And then as the crises grow, create solutions that will create even more crises. And that's exactly what they've done. So you have to look at it as an asymmetric strategy of military conquest. That's what it really is. It has nothing to do with these individual issues as standalone problems that they invent and then make worse. It is all a strategy to defeat our country without firing a shot.
Where do you think they went wrong with blue collar workers? They've clearly lost a step with unions. Um, just kind of, obviously that was their base. The unions were run by the Marxists, more or less, at least all the big ones were. And the workers are
Yeah,
just like, what are you doing for me?
yeah, yeah. Well, for a long time, the trade unions, as opposed to the international unions like SEIU and those which are always communist unions, um, the International Workers of the World. These are communist trade unions, but the actual trade unions, like for the auto workers and groups like that, for many decades, they were run by strident anti-communists who, while they wanted to, boost the wages and the benefits for people in the unions and frankly at the expense of non-union people, because it was another power play, frankly. But they were at least anti-communist. But in 1995, the AFL-CIO elected a triumvirate of three members who were all communists, and they flipped they reopened the management slots, which had been banned for decades, reopened them to communists, and communists took over the top layers of the management of these unions, and they don't care about the people they represent. The people they represent are being used for them to expand the power of the radical left. So we had trade unions flip from being hardcore anti immigration, both legal and illegal, to being open borders advocates, while all of their dues paying workers either were laid off or put in lesser positions. And so it's all about the agenda. It's always been about the agenda for the left. And I think that one of the best examples is the National Education Association, which has been a communist organization since the 1930s, when it was led by John Dewey, who has been called the father of public education. And he was an admirer of the Soviet education system, and he wanted to impose that here. And he was their director back in the 30s. But today they're as every bit as radical. I did a piece for the Epoch Times a number of years ago on why the unions betray their workers, and I make the point that the American Federation of Teachers, it wasn't the NEA, it was the American Federation of Teachers, had a survey they conducted every 5 years of the political aspects of their teachers. And believe it or not, I think the last one was done in 2005. It's the one I quote anyway in that study, which was written, actually about 2014 or so, maybe earlier. At least 55% of the teachers in that survey identified as conservative. Yet the AFT and the NEA have donated at least 95% of their employee donations to the Democratic Party for decades. So the people who pay the dues paying union members, are not represented. Now, of course, I think the the teachers in the union and the administrators have become much more left leaning today than they were then. But it was surprising that even in the early aughts, most teachers, identified themselves as conservative or moderate.
That's interesting that you mentioned the AFT because I wrote a piece in 2012 where they sent out a survey to every member running for the New Hampshire House of Representatives. That's a 400-seat body, so that's a lot of surveys, and most people wouldn't fill them out. but I went through the survey and there wasn't a single question about education or children. Not one. It was all political. Do you
Yeah,
support abortion? Are you for,
yeah,
I mean, it was just
yeah,
insane how absurd it was and how obvious this
yeah,
is. And, people don't see those things. So I love it when we get to report it. I love it when I get to see your books and talk to you.
yeah.
Another big thing that was concerning people, I have a friend, Aaron Day, who ran for president just so he could meet with people to talk about the threat of digital currency. And of course, this all ties into social credit scores and
Mm,
ESG, and you do an entire chapter on that.
yep. Yeah, no, well, social credit scores, all of that stuff comes right out of Agenda 21, uh, with, the three E's of equity, environment, and social equity, environment. What's the third one? Gosh, I'm losing my mind. I forget these things
That's
so fast.
okay.
It's incredible. Three, equity, economy, and environment. And so, the intersection of those three is equal to an, sustainable development. When you have all those three intersecting, when you have social equity, which is socialism, environmental, policy, and an economy, when they all intersect, you have sustainable development, which is development in the present that does not take away from development for future generations. And what's the implicit assumption of that? It's that there has to be some central government authority that decides how many resources should be used today so that we could provide a sustainable future. And that automatically assumes centralized control over everything. And just it's another word for socialism. So in the excuse me, early aughts, they decided that they would expand that because they needed more money. So they expand that into the investment field with ESG, and that's economics, social equity, and government. Oh, now think about that. They replaced economy with government. So now they make the role of government implicit in that. And who brought that forward more than anybody else but Barack Hussein Obama with the idea of companies and government becoming partners, partner government, right? Except if you're talking about government, you're only always talking about government as the senior partner and corporations being the junior partner. Now, what is that? What is that? Well, actually, that is the true definition of fascism, isn't it? Because fascism was created um, in the 1920s by the he was a communist at the time, but he realized that he couldn't be elected as a communist. So he comes up with the idea of this system where private enterprise would be allowed to live, be allowed to continue. Their assets would not be confiscated, but they would come into partnerships with the government so that it could be managed. And that became the Italian fascist party. And the founder of that was Benito Mussolini. And Hitler thought, gee, that's a great idea. So we'll create a fascist party in Germany. And guess what we're going to call that? The National Socialist Party, Germany, the Nazis. So the Nazis are fascists. The Italians were fascists. And the Obama administration was at its heart fascist. And that's essentially what the Biden administration continued for the next 4 years. And then by creating DEI and ESG, they forced private companies in these partnerships to pursue policies that didn't help the bottom line, but instead help spread the wealth to people who had no vested interest in it. And they were given scores by organizations like KPMG that would rate them on their commitment to ESG concepts. And so all these companies started doing this, and that's how we got woke companies. And they started doing this, and they were rated. And what was that rating? It's a kind of social credit score, because if you get a bad social credit score, maybe this government or that government isn't going to include your company in their pension plan, right? So they suffered unless they went for that program. That's why we got all these woke companies, in addition to the fact that as they came up, more and more people graduating from college were leftists anyway because they're being indoctrinated by their radical left teachers. But this moves closer and closer to the Chinese concept of social credit. And they tried to do that during COVID by creating, you know, uh, world um, identification, electric identification cards for all people. And that was the first step towards creating a social credit system for Americans. And they're still working on that. And that's something that Trump administration is going to have to put an end to very rapidly, although many companies are now, they're losing so much money through these programs that a lot of them are just bailing out and say, all right, give us a bad score. We don't give a damn. Yeah, we don't, we're tired of losing money, and our shareholders are really getting fed up with all this garbage.
One of the ironic side effects that I noticed, it started with the wind industry, but it's affected everybody. And I think it has a great deal to do with why they're so willing to shed their DEI departments. Part of this process creates inflation, and inflation made everything so expensive that it became so difficult to do business that they were like, well, where can we cut? And then Trump gets elected, and they're like, well, we don't need these DEI guys anymore. Let's get rid of them because they're going to cost us more money than it's
Right,
worth. And, everybody's been bending the knee to him and everything.
right.
And they're like, well, he's got 4 years. He doesn't have to run for office again. What's this going to look like? And I guess that's my question. You talk about what is to be done. You outline all these great issues in detail. And if you are curious about the depth of this and you understand it on a superficial level and it's affected you in some way, get this book, Manufactured Crisis, The War to End America, because Jim does a great job of itemizing what's going on, what's been going on, and you need to understand it to fight it, either in social media or as on-the-ground activism or as an assistant for a political campaign, or even if you're going to run for office, which Jim did. He ran for office. He ran for Congress in Maryland.
Yeah.
And so that is an experience you can share if you want to. But let's look at what the Trump administration really needs to focus on, do you think?
Yeah, no, well, they have a big job ahead of them. And, as I say in the conclusion, which, by the way, uh, includes solutions to practically every issue identified in that book, because, you identify a problem, you don't provide a solution, you're not doing much good. So I have just at page after page after page after page lists of things that we can do in election reform, in education reform, in legal reform, in labor reform, in immigration, and a long list of things. Islam, we have to think about that, especially now once we start seeing more attacks from Islamic radicals once again, like we did in New Orleans this Christmas, tragically. I mean, these are things that we have to focus on. But I would say the very first thing that the administration has to do once it gets into office, well, Trump is going to revoke every single executive order that Biden created. That would be a good first step. Uh, but they need to focus on sealing the border and then starting with the criminals, but proceeding through the entire list, ordering people to go home, ordering people to go back to their home countries. We have between 30 and 50 million illegal immigrants living in the United States today. You know, don't believe the statistics that come out of the DHS, which have added a few million to the bogus, bogus number. They've been using 11 to 12 million as the number of illegals in the United States since 2001. How could it still be that, even though we're having millions coming across a month and we're having hundreds of thousands coming across a month during Trump and most of Trump's administration and 50,000 a month during Obama's administration? How does that happen? Now, we have between 30 and 50 million illegal aliens here from hundreds of countries, many of them hostile to the United States. We have foreign armies in this country. We have Chinese communist men who I guarantee you are military men, and they're probably staying on one or more of the many properties that the communist Chinese have inexplicably been allowed to purchase throughout the United States, many of them right next to military installations. That stuff has to go. That stuff has to go right away, and those people have to be told to leave. And if they don't willingly leave, we need to pick up arms and tell them, you're going to leave right now, or you're going to get the consequences. I mean, really, it's come to that, and it may turn into some kind of you know insurgency battle. But we have to get those people out of this country ASAP. But we can create the grounds that fertile grounds in, for example, Mexico, especially Central America and South America. Uh, we can create fertile grounds that will make a lot of those people want to go home because most of those people, and I know this because I've studied it, as you know, for over a decade, and I've written 2 books about it, and I've continued to study, and I talk to people in Central America about it. Um, Most of those people didn't want to leave their countries. They were essentially forced by the hard left running those countries, making life so unbearable that they had to flee. And at the same time, the United Nations and the U.S. government, the State Department, and the U.S. government opened the borders, and the UN sent in at least 5 different agencies to assist in this migration. Hundreds of American tax exempt organizations went there to help. And so these people got the stick of having a horrible place to live being made increasingly worse on purpose by the left, and the carrot of America saying, our doors are open, come on up, and we'll even help you get there. And so all that stuff has to end overnight. Those people that enabled that, I think they should go to jail. I think we should start prosecuting people for enabling that mass migration. But we can also help those Central American countries uh, become fertile grounds once again for vibrant uh, uh, societies, affluent societies, like Bukele has done in El Salvador. He's done an amazing job. He's been a little bit hard-handed, but maybe that's necessary. But in any event, people are going back to El Salvador because it's now a nice place to live. It's a safe place to live. It used to be a terrorist place to live. You know, MS-13 ran the place. Now they're all in jail or dead. And we can make the same kind of things, we can encourage the same kind of things in Guatemala, which is where 60% of the children, many of whom 230,000 at least are vanished. Nobody knows where they've gone. 60% of Guatemalans came to were the from the Central American countries that came in that migration. And it, yeah, so those we can help those countries get rid of these radicals and restore them to or help them develop in the countries with the potential that they all have, because they all have enormous potential to be great affluent societies that nobody would want to leave. And many of the people that fled those countries because of those conditions would happily self-deport if given that situation. So we can do a lot of things, but that's number one, immigration.
Yeah, and you look at like countries like Argentina, which have had a complete
Yep.
180-degree flip just by electing the right guy. And he's not a
Yep.
tyrant. He's not some American puppet despot. You know, he's
No,
just the people
that's
have
right.
had enough, kind of like Americans.
Yeah. No, and we had in Brazil, we had Bonacero, and he was had the election stolen from him by Lulu, who was a communist, a criminal, and so in order to restore integrity in that nation, uh, that's a big job. But we could help with that. We could help with that. We could help restore integrity to their electoral system and help him get elected again or somebody else. He was called Brazil's Trump, you know, and he
Hmm.
ruled for a little while. But there's so much corruption, there's so much infiltration of the government by the radical left that it really requires a lot to work on. Same thing with Chile. Chile was a beautiful place, one of the most prosperous places, the most prosperous country in South America, ironically under Pinochet, who everybody hates. But he took the steps he needed to take to get rid of the communists who had infiltrated the government, the Castro supported communists, by the way, who had infiltrated the government and taken over everything, were threatening to turn it communist. Well, now guess what? They've won again. They're back in. So Chile has turned hard left. Peru has turned hard left. Colombia has turned hard left. Venezuela, of course, that's the worst of them. But all of those could be, with the right foreign policy, the right people in place, and a commitment to it, those countries could throw the communists out and become great U.S. allies again, and the entire Western Hemisphere could become prosperous once again.
So this kind of feeds what is probably my final question. Donald Trump had to overcome a lot of hurdles to get where he is. The entire blob is against him. The world community is against him. The WEF is against him. The UN is against him. Hundreds of those NGOs, all of those religious groups that make
Yeah,
money off refugee resettlement. Literally everyone, the
yeah,
Chinese, the Iranians, the
yeah,
Russians, they're, I mean, so he won the election, which is, of course, a miracle. And he
yeah.
gets inaugurated tomorrow. This will broadcast the day after. No, on Wednesday, sorry. And everybody's been holding their breath, waiting for somebody to try to assassinate him again. And of course, now the entire ceremony is indoors, which people are much more comfortable with. But all of this energy in the world against him. He appears to be getting the cabinet he wants. He looks like he's going to get the appointees he wants, but they're going to have a lot of work to do internally before we even deal with the rest of the world. Is there any advice you would like to provide?
Well, unlike a lot of people, I'm concerned about some of his highly critical appointments. There's a lot of things that, well, my friend Trevor Loudon has written um, about the appointment for the Director of National Intelligence, the young lady, former Democrat, former radical left Democrat, who supported the Iran deal, among many other things. And now she's being put in as the director of the Office of National Intelligence. There's a number of people that uh, I don't think Tulsi Gabbard has the bandwidth to take on a job that's big. I mean, I like the way she talks. I like the way she supported Trump, but I also don't, I'm kind of don't trust her entirely because of the totally opposite positions she took during most of her time as a member of Congress. Uh, I also don't know that Pete Hegseth is up to the job. He may be. I hope he is. But I think there's better people, more qualified people that Trump could be getting. He needs to get top people because the battle that they're going to have to engage in with the bureaucracy is a battle royale. And they're going to have to really fight, and they're going to have to be very clever, and they're going to have to be very strong. And I'm hoping that the people that he has appointed are up to that task, but I have my doubts in some cases.
That's a fair thing to say. I think that we're willing to be forgiving and to accept people when they've legitimately claimed that they've turned over a leaf. But again, you got to prove it, right? And
Absolutely.
as somebody who's been in the bureaucracy, you
Mhm.
really literally have a grasp on this that most people don't even understand.
Wow.
Um, is it really? Is it worse than we imagine?
Well, back in the 80s and 90s, when I was there, I saw what was coming. At that time, from a budget perspective, I was writing the budgets for what would later become DHS agencies, but at the time were under the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department was the first law enforcement agency, created the Customs Service, which was the very first law enforcement agency in the country. They created the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They created the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. They created the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, um, the U.S. Secret Service. They were all under the Treasury Department. And it was my job to write their budgets. So I knew all about those organizations. And they all, more than anything else, they were all at the top concerned about getting more money every year, more authority every year, more people every year. So they are always looking to build their budgets. And because the Congress was controlled, both houses, by Democrats, they would just, play up to the Democrats uh, and do whatever they thought that the Democrats would approve of for them to get more money in their budgets. And the classic example of that was when ATF raided the Branch Davidian compound. They didn't need to do that. They did that because they wanted to create a big splash in the news so that the very anti gun Senate uh, Appropriations Committee leader, Dennis DeConcini, and his partner in the House Appropriations Committee for the Treasury branch would be impressed and give them a bigger cut of the budget because they literally complained to me. The director of enforcement of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco Enforcement, directly under the director of the ATF, he literally complained to my boss and I on the phone, whining about how the FBI always got more money in their budget than they did. And that was really literally the first concern. So the point is, at that time, there were still plenty of conservatives in law enforcement in the federal government, and many of them were, willing to do a really good job. You could see the ATF starting to get, really get more real anti-gun type people in it, but they weren't all like that at that time. But they all had a mission, and the mission was to enforce firearms laws, and they had a hard left appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate they had to please in order to get that money. So by default, they were going to become radical leftist. By default, they were going to adapt left-wing policies. Now, when Reagan was in there, and even when Bush was in there, they would propose programs that the left wouldn't really would find it hard to oppose, like the armed career criminal statutes, which were proposed by Reagan, that gave enhanced penalties for armed career criminals who are carrying guns illegally. They get minimum of 5 to 20 years in jail. So there were those kinds of things that both parties could agree to. And the Republicans would always say, oh, well, we need more ATF, or we need more customs officers at this or that office that, both parties would go along with. There were things like that. But the general drift was always to please the guys in control. And the guys in control for almost an entire century were the left, the Democrats, both houses of Congress, until in 1994 when when the Republicans took over, and even that didn't last. So that's what's and still to this day, and also the bureaucracy became more leftist as younger people graduated from college, migrated into the government, more and more left wing. So now the government is like pretty much 95% Democrat. The bureaucracies are, and many of the committees in Congress are still directed, if not explicitly run, by Democrats because they have had the institutional knowledge for so long that they still hold sway over many committees, even though they're no longer in the majority.
So Trump has a lot of work ahead of him. The Republicans, if they're willing, have a lot of work ahead of them. And manufactured crisis gives you a lot of background on why this is a problem and how we got where we are. So how do people contact you or get your book?
Well, I do have an Amazon page. They can go on Amazon and search my name and put in manufactured crisis or just the title of the book. It should come up. If they go to my website, crisisnow.net, that's crisisnow.net, there's links directly to the Amazon page where they can order it. Or if they want a signed copy, they can write me at simpson.truth@gmail.com, simpson.truth@gmail.com. Write to me and tell me you want to get a signed copy, and I'll tell you how much it costs and where to send the check.
All right, Jim, thanks. You're working on another book?
I actually am, and it's about Guatemala and how our foreign policy has done. It's probably the best example, or at least the most important example, of how the American State Department has perverted foreign policy to destroy these countries and enable communists to infiltrate them and take over. Most recently, the State Department helped elect a communist as president in Guatemala by deliberately engaging in vote fraud. And we have the proof of it. And so these are things that I want to talk about.
Great. I'm going to look forward to that book, and we'll do another interview when you publish that thing. So, Jim Simpson, thank you very much for spending time with us, and enjoy what's left of your weekend.
Yes, sir. And as always, it is a great time to be with you, Steve, and thanks for having me.